Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Layak Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. Let us continue our weaving from where we left off in part 2 and moving to part 3. It begins with a memory you can hold in your hands. You are a child at the edge of the ocean at night. The tide is out. The wet sand is a dark mirror, and the moon lays a trembling path of silver across it. You pick one bright glimmer, one small shard of reflected light, and you think, almost without words, that is the reflection right here. You give it a home. You anchor it in your mind. Then a cloud passes. The silver path vanishes. The water shifts. When the moonlight returns, the glimmer is elsewhere. You look for the same reflection, and you realize the question is wrong. The reflection never had an address. It was never a thing sitting on the sand. It was a relation. Moon to water to eye. A pattern that exists only in comparison, never in isolation. If someone could slide the entire silver path sideways by the same amount across the shoreline, the essential scene would not change. Only your chosen 0 point would move. That is not a metaphor for phi. It is a first lesson in phi thinking. Because in the pure phi language, the most dangerous mistake is also the most human one. You point at a circle and you insist it has a beginning. Now imagine you and I standing before a perfect ring, a circular dial. Not a clock, not a compass, not a wheel that measures anything. Just a circle as pure structure, continuous, closed, with no privileged start. I take a piece of chalk and draw a tiny mark and I say, this is 0. Then I ask you, did the circle itself change when I did that? No. The mark is my convenience. The circle remains what it is. Part 3 of episode 13b is where we remove the chalk mark from our ontology. This is the first firewall shock of the pure phi language. Absolute phi is mute. Only differences survive. We formally quotient by global shifts, phi to the phi plus c. And if we do not install this rule here, before calculus, before topology, before objects, before any story of a universe, we will cheat later without even noticing. We will confuse our pencil marks for structure. We will turn private conventions into public claims. We will build a whole cathedral on a coordinate choice and call it reality. So tonight, you and I do something quiet and severe. We don't add new content. We subtract illegitimate meaning. Let's anchor where we are in the long arc you already carry. From episode 13a, you carry the silent ground phi as permission, not substance. No containers, no absolutes, no teleology. Phi is irreducible and unavoidable as the ground of public distinction. From part 1 of 13b, you carry the single letter of the alphabet, phi, XS1, a circle-valued assignment, not energy. Energy is a tally, a report of change, not an ontic ingredient, not a field inside space-time, a cyclic order token that makes comparability possible. From part 2, you carry X, not space-time, but minimal event support, patches, overlaps, refinements, so local talk can exist without importing geometry. Now part 3 installs the rule that tells us what counts as a sentence at all. Because once you allow a circle-valued primitive, you inherit a temptation. You try to ask for its absolute value. You try to say, what is phi here? As if here already has a cosmic ruler, and phi already has a cosmic 0. But a point on a circle has no absolute coordinate unless you choose one. And if your physics depends on your choice of zero, your physics is not physics, it's notation. That's the essence of the gauge quotient rule, not a fancy slogan, a hygiene law for meaning. Let's say it in everyday language as plainly as possible. If you rotate the entire phase circle, labeling by the same amount everywhere, if you add the same constant c to every phi value, you have not changed the structure. You have only changed your label. Therefore, any statement that changes under phi to phi plus c is not a statement about structure. It is a statement about your label. That's it. That's the rule. Now we have to make that rule feel inevitable, not imposed. And we do it with the four gates: WF, INV, DOM, NEC. Not as a list, but as a living discipline that keeps the language honest. Start with the well-formedness gate. In this part, a sentence is only a sentence if it descends to the gauge quotient, meaning it must make sense as a statement about the equivalence class of phi, not about a particular representative. If that sounds abstract, I want you to translate it into something you already know: music. A melody remains the same melody when you transpose it. You can sing the same song starting from a different pitch. The structure is carried by intervals. If someone insists the song is wrong because it is in a different key, they are talking about a convention, not the relational form of the tune. The tune is the equivalence class under transposition. The absolute pitch is the chalk mark. Our language is the same. Phi is like a circular pitch label. The physical content is what remains after you erase the choice of starting pitch. So a well-formed statement cannot be phi p equals 0. That is like saying, this song begins on middle C, as if middle C is the essence of the song. It's not. It's a choice. A well-formed statement must survive the constant shift. It must be built out of comparisons, not absolute placements. You can hear the discipline already. We are training ourselves to stop asking, what is the phase here? And to start asking, how does phase compare between here and there? Or, what happens when phase is traced around a closed loop? Or, what is invariant under shifting the entire circle? This is not mysticism. It's how public meaning is carved out of redundancy. Now the invariance gate. Here the rule becomes a single, unforgiving test. Phi fal plus c equals f fal for all constant shifts c. Not most of the time, not approximately. If your proposed observable fails this, it is not an observable in pure phi language. And this is where the word gauge can mislead people. So let's clean it carefully. In everyday physics classes, gauge often arrives with electromagnetism and potentials and vector fields. That's later. Not allowed this primitive content here. Here, gauge means something even simpler and deeper: equivalence under redescription. It is the principle that public statements must not depend on your private choice of origin. Think of calendars. Different cultures choose different year zeros. Yet we can translate because what matters are intervals and relations. The treaty signed 10 years after another treaty is still 10 years after, regardless of which calendar you use. The gauge quotient is the calendar translation law of the phase circle. Think of altitude. You can measure heights relative to sea level or relative to a different baseline. Mountains don't care. What matters are differences in elevation, slopes, changes. The baseline is arbitrary. If your claim about a mountain changes because someone used a different sea level reference, your claim was not about the mountain. Same with phi. Now the domain gate. This one matters because people love to cheat by vagueness. They say something that sounds invariant, but only because they never said where it applies. Remember part 2. X exists only as patchwork talk. Patches p phi and overlaps p phi al are where meaning is audited. So gauge meaning must hold on each declared patch and overlap. You cannot hide gauge dependence in a region you didn't specify. If your statement is about patch p, then shifting phi by a constant on that patch must not change its meaning. If your statement involves two patches and their overlap, the invariance must survive the overlap reconciliation. In other words, no gauge in the basement. No secret 0 point smuggled into the walls. This gate is what keeps the language universal. It ensures that meaning is not the artifact of one coordinate chart or one convenient patch choice. It must be stable under legitimate redescription everywhere you claim to speak. Now, the non-encodability challenge. This is where someone stands up and says, I don't accept it. I think absolute phi matters. I think there is a privilege 0. I think the universe has a true phase origin. Our language does not argue. It challenges. Show us, using only PS0 tokens, that absolute phase has public consequences that cannot be removed. But you are not allowed to smuggle in measurement devices, protocols, instrument models, or anything like that. Those are later. You're not allowed to name physical semantics like electrons or gravity. Those are later. You're not allowed to import a metric or a causal order. Those are forbidden at PS0. You must produce, inside the PO5 vocabulary, a publicly distinguishable invariant that changes under phi plus c and yet remains well-formed, domain-honest, and representation-independent. This is a brutal demand, and it is meant to be, because to insist on absolute phase is to insist on additional structure, a preferred point on S1, a crown on the circle. And crowns are not free. If you want one, you must pay with a proof of necessity. Now, let's make the listener feel the heart of why this rule is not philosophical decoration, but functional necessity. You already carry triunity. Omega, kappa, nu will be readouts of the derivative object A equals d phi plus. And you already carry the discipline. We never treat omega, kappa, nu as primitives. They are readouts that must recombine. Here is the key. Derivatives erase constants. If I take any local lift phi pla and add a constant c, the derivative does not change. D phi plus c equals d phi plus. So if the public readouts of cadence, texture, and transport are built from derivatives, they must be blind to the global constant. That blindness is not a limitation. It is the condition for public agreement. Because imagine a world where absolute phi mattered. Then two observers who choose different phase origins would disagree about what time is, or what distance is, or what motion is, simply because they chose different zeros. Reality would fracture into conventions. Triunity would become private dialect. Public science would collapse. The gauge quotient rule is what guarantees that when we later read omega, kappa, nu from A, we are all reading the same thing, regardless of our chosen origin. So gauge quotient is not philosophy. It is the precondition for shared readout. Now we need to talk about what absolute phi is mute really means, without drifting into forbidden things. Here is the clean meaning. Phi itself is a label on a circle, and any global rotation of that label is redundant. The only content is in how phi varies and how it closes, not in where its 0 sits. To help your intuition, let's use one of the most familiar examples of gauge in everyday life: electric potential, but carefully, as analogy only. In the old language, we say the electric potential here is 220 volts. But 220 relative to what? Relative to a ground we chose. The physics is not in the absolute potential. It is in the difference between potentials. That difference drives current. That difference stores energy. The absolute number is a bookkeeping convenience. And remember episode 2? Energy is not ontic substance, it's a tally. It is a report built from differences and changes. Potentials are like tallies too. Their absolute values are conventions, only differences carry operational meaning. Holophase simply refuses to let that convenience masquerade as fundamental. So the rule phi to the phi plus c is the fundamental version of only differences matter. It's a radical minimalism that prevents us from inventing unobservable ghosts. Now, because our listener is human, we have to address the natural confusion. If absolute phi is meaningless, how do we ever talk at all? How do we ever compute anything? We compute by choosing a representative, by fixing the gauge, temporarily, the way you choose a coordinate system. But then you must show that your final result does not depend on that choice. Just like you might choose a coordinate system to solve a geometry problem, but the length of a side of a triangle does not depend on the coordinate system. So when we later choose a lift phi nu on a patch, that lift is a computational representative. The physical content is not the lift itself. It is what survives when you shift the lift. This is why we keep repeating. The equivalence class is the reality, not the representative. Now, to make this truly easy to grasp, let's give the listener a sharp bad sentence versus good sentence contrast. Because that is how grammar is learned. Bad sentence. At event P, phi of P equals to 0. Why bad? Because it depends on the choke mark. Under phi to phi plus c, it becomes phi of P equals c, which is not the same statement unless c equals 0. It fails invariance. It fails WF. Good sentence. Between events P and Q, the phase difference is delta. This depends only on comparison. If you shift both by c, the difference remains delta. It passes invariance. Even better sentence. Around the closed loop gamma, the holonomy is H. Again, shifting phi by a constant does not change a closed loop phase memory. It passes. What you are hearing here, without us fully formalizing it yet, is the deep structure of future observables. They will be built from derivatives and closures, because those are the operations that kill the constant. Derivatives kill constants locally. Closed loops kill constants globally. That's why this part matters so much. It tells us what kinds of tokens can never become public. Now, let's be careful about a subtlety that can confuse even advanced people. We said, we quotient by global shifts, phi if phi plus c. Why global? Why not allow shifting by different amounts in different places? That is the difference between a global gauge and a local gauge. Local gauge symmetries are deeper and richer and can emerge later when we talk about patching and lift transitions and when we demand compatibility across overlaps. But at PS0 foundation level, the inescapable minimum is the global shift, because S1 itself has no preferred origin. So we keep it minimal, one constant shift across the domain of discourse. The domain matters. If X were disconnected into separate components with no overlap, you could shift each component independently and nothing could compare them. But in the usual connected patchwork, where meaning is shared through overlaps, the shift is global. That's enough for now. The main point is, this is the minimal removal of arbitrariness. Now we must integrate the grammar generates universes theme without drifting into dynamics. Gauge quotient is a grammar constraint. It limits the kinds of admissible expressions. It means any later law we write, when we are finally allowed to write laws, must be built out of gauge invariant combinations. It can never depend on phi itself without a mechanism that cancels the constant. So gauge quotient is a shaping force. It is like a rule in poetry. You must write in rhyme. The rule doesn't tell you what the poem will say, but it constrains what kinds of lines are possible. Here, the rhyme scheme is invariance under phi to phi plus c. That is why you can feel it already as a firewall. It prevents a whole category of nonsense sentences from ever being admitted. Now let's deepen again with analogies, but keep them scattered and not dumped. A civilizational analogy. Money redenomination. If a country removes 2 zeros from its currency, every price is divided by 100. The economy doesn't change. The ratios remain. Only the labels change. If you make a claim about wealth that depends on whether we count in old currency or new, your claim is not about wealth, it's about notation. Absolute phi is old currency versus new currency. Gauge quotient says, the world is the economy, not the printed digits. A biological analogy. Gene numbering. Two labs can number the same gene from different reference points on the chromosome. The gene doesn't change. What matters is the pattern of base pairs and their relations. The position number is gauge. Biology is invariant under relabeling. A human perception analogy. Brightness. Your eyes adapt. Walk from sunlight into a dark room and your baseline shifts. The absolute brightness you feel changes, but you still detect edges, differences. Vision is differential. The baseline is not the image. The contrasts are. Holophase is a differential vision of reality. Gauge quotient removes the baseline. Now, because your instruction is firewalled, we must state the prediction falsification in the correct grammatical form, not as empirical measurement. So the prediction of this part is all real observables, meaning all admissible PS0 language statements, will be expressible without choosing a preferred zero of phi. They will be functions of gauge invariant combinations, differences, derivatives, topological closures, and later, invariants built from jets and holonomy. The falsifier is find a reproducible structural invariant, formulated purely with PS0 tokens, that changes under the global shift phi to phi plus c, while remaining well-formed, domain-declared, and representation-independent. If such an invariant exists, then the gauge quotient rule is wrong. Absolute phase carries meaning. The language would need revision. This is the clean internal falsification. Not an experiment result, but a contradiction in grammar. Now, let's address a deeper intuition you can carry. Why this rule is a kind of humility. In episode 13a, we learned not to start with absolutes. No absolute existence predicate, no absolute container, no absolute substance. Here we extend that humility into a very specific place. No absolute phase. The universe, in this language, does not hand you a cosmic zero. It hands you relations. It hands you comparability. It hands you patterns. And if you want a zero, you can draw one with chalk, but you must never confuse it for the ring itself. This is where the story of the moon reflection returns. A child wants the reflection to have a home. A scientist learns the reflection is a relation. And holophase begins exactly at that maturation, refusing to assign homes to things that are inherently relational. Now I want to make one more point, because it will prevent confusion later when we begin lifting and differentiating. When we later lift phi to free on a patch, we will also have another equivalence. Free to free plus 2 pi n. That is not the same as phi to phi plus c, but it is related. It is the freedom to choose which turn of the circle you represent in the real line. It's like choosing which floor number you call the same height on a spiral staircase. Add 2 pi and you're back to the same phase on the circle, but you've moved one full turn on the lift. Both freedoms must be invisible to admissible sentences. But part 3 is about the continuous global shift. It is the chalk mark. And now, with that clarity, you can see why A equals d phi will be so central. A is blind to both. It is the first object that is automatically public. And because omega, kappa, nu will be readouts of A, triunity will be public too. That is why we keep reminding, triunity is not three primitives. It is one derivative seen three ways. The derivative's blindness to constants is the reason the readouts can be shared. So part 3 is not merely a symmetry. It is the seal that makes later readouts non-arbitrary. Now we close this part as a narrator should, with one sentence that the listener can carry like a talisman. Here is the cleanest version. If your claim changes when we rotate the phase circle by a constant, your claim was not about reality. It was about your chosen zero. And here is the more poetic version, but still PS0 clean. Absolute phase is a silence. Physics begins only where one phase can be compared to another. Now we bridge to the next part naturally. We have phi, we have x, we have erased absolute phase, but we have not yet earned the right to differentiate. We have not yet declared where calculus is legitimate, how smooth phi must be, and how deep into derivatives we are allowed to speak without inventing structure by taking illegal derivatives. That is why the next part installs patching and regularity typing. It teaches the language to say, on this patch, derivatives up to this order exist, and it refuses to let us speak beyond that. It is the grammar that prevents false universes created by over-differentiation. So we step forward now with our circle still unmarked, our chalk still in our pocket, and our language finally clean enough to talk about change without cheating. The reflection has no home, the circle has no zero, and that is exactly what makes the next words possible. Always, peace be upon you.